So welcome to 8 Steps to Inner Peace and Happiness. For those of you who have joined a webinar before, you obviously recognize Edward Chatove, who has moderated these talks before. But our special guest author this time is Eugene Aucoin. So I'm just going to give a little bio about each of them before they start a discussion. And then during their talk, please feel free to use the Q&A function. You can see it on the top of your screen. Writing in your questions is kind of the only way we'll be able to go into those conversations. So just take advantage of Q&A. And I'm going to let them talk for about 35 minutes, and then I'll come back on screen and help moderate those questions because we want to get to your questions and make sure you're getting like what you want out of this webinar as well. So let me introduce our moderator, Edward Chatove. Edward Chatove is a priest, Augustinian of the Assumption. Of Russian origin, he lived in France, England, and Romania before coming to Canada. Edward Chatove is passionate about the Word of God, history, literature, theology, and art. He knows the Holy Land well, having visited it several times. In 2020, he published A Russian Pilgrim in the 21st Century by Mediapol Publishing Group. He is the director of the Culture and Faith Center at Montmater in Quebec City. He is a columnist on Radio VM, and he also hosts the webinars of Novalis Publishing Group in French. And then let me introduce to you our special guest author for this webinar, Eugene Aucoin. Eugene Aucoin is a retired human resources director and university professor. He spoke around the world about nurturing human potential, and his passion is sharing his love for the teachings of Jesus. His first book, Has Science Killed God?, won Asia's Best Catholic Book of the Year in Theology in 2020. Eugene also gives seminars about faith. So I'm gonna leave the screen and let you guys get talking just about this theme. I'm super excited to hear, and I'm sure our attendees are as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Leslie Jane. Good morning, Eugene, good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. And today we will be discussing a few subjects about happiness, about inner peace. And it is around your new published books. It is called the Beatitudes, 8 Steps to Inner Peace and Happiness by Novalis Publishing Group. Eugene, the theme of the book and the reflection what we will have, and we will invite everyone to read your book, 8 Steps to Inner Peace and Happiness. Why this theme of happiness and peace is important for you? Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Certainly. And thank you to Novalis for inviting me to do this this webinar. I'm very, very grateful. Yeah, I've spent most of my career in human resources, as it's been said, and I've been dealing a lot with people issues and mediating conflicts and so on, and I've seen a lot of people suffering, a lot of people craving inner peace. And very often I wanted to tell them about Jesus's easy solution to many of the problems they were going through, and a lot of the hard emotions we all go through sooner or later. And also in my volunteer work with dying patients at the hospital, I've seen the same thing. And you can't always talk about religious things in the context that I was working in, or in my conferences around the world, or training managers, so on. But it seems to me that Jesus's solution was it was such the solution to many of the problems I've seen. Now that I'm retired, I decided to go all out and to say in this book what I've always wanted to say about Jesus being the solution to so many of our problems. It is an 8-step recipe for inner peace, joy, and to become the best version of ourselves. Now, you guessed it, I'm a big fan of the teachings of Jesus. And I think I have to say, sometimes we don't put enough attention on what Jesus said, because we tend to forget who he was. If you think about it, 2,000 years ago, God came to talk to us, to tell us about things like how to find what we're all looking for every single moment of our lives. There are 8.2 billion people in the world, and we're all doing the same thing. We're all looking for happiness, beatitude. We're doing it 8.2 billion different ways, but we're all doing it. So I think I wanted to reach out to as many people as I can to tell them about Jesus's recipe to find that. I think, if sometimes I think if an alien visitor landed on the front lawn of the United Nations in New York with all the media of the world pointed on it, and somebody came out and said, "I've come to tell you from an advanced civilization how to find joy and peace and resolve the world's problems," I think we'd listen. We wouldn't switch channels. And that's why I think the fact that God came to talk to us 2,000 years ago is mind-boggling. And I think there's so much we can gain by listening to him. That's it.
Eugene, when I looked at your reflection and what you just said, it appears to me that it is true that in our search for happiness, inner peace, we would look at human resources, and certainly you did in your work. We will explore all kind of psychological means, but this final ingredient that you call Jesus Christ and the relationship with Jesus Christ remains very, very often, I say, ignored or put apart. And what is interesting in what you're saying, that and in the Christian world and the world of believers, generally speaking, and maybe even in the world of non-believers, it has an interest to take into account the precisely the figure of Jesus Christ in this search, in this quest, in this journey for happiness. But let me ask you the question a little bit further. We're all looking for happiness, and we know this. But why do you think, or at least give us some elements, why the happiness is so elusive? Why it's like we're all searching for this, and even if we find it, let's hope that we do sometime, it's like for 20 seconds, okay, for 2 minutes, but why it is so elusive?
Yeah, that's a really great question. In fact, it constitutes the first part of my book. The book is in three parts: the problem, the solution, and how to apply the solution. And when I say the solution, I have no merit in that. It's Jesus' solution. I'm just, reporting it. But the reason is because most people are on a very busy double-lane highway to nowhere. It's in their search for happiness. Why do I say it's a double-lane highway? Well, the first lane is to get more and more of what we want. And you're asked why it's so elusive. What we're trying to do, we spend our whole lives trying to become a better and better and better servant of our ego. And we get pretty good at it. And we think we've succeeded in life when we've mastered the art of slavery to our ego. But we're still, even the best slave in the world is still a slave. And it's always elusive because it's an impossible task to satisfy our ego. Why is that? Because we're trying to fill a bottomless void that can only be filled God's way. We're trying to fill it with stuff and with maybe celebrity, with everything we can imagine. But it's an impossible task. It's kind of like puffing on a cigarette to get what passes for satisfaction. It doesn't last very long. You're puffing on it again. And I think that's that's one of the two lanes. When I say it's a double lane highway, one of the lanes is trying to get more and more of what we want by pleasing our ego, which is never pleased, wants more and more. The second lane is the lane of trying to get less and less of what we don't want. There are always some irritants in our way of happiness. We think, if only I didn't have a sore leg, if only my neighbor wasn't so noisy, if only. You could call that the Oh, you know, that reminds me that, have you ever played that game, Whack-A-Mole?
No,
No, it doesn't ring a bell? Okay. There's
no.
a game at summer fairs. Sometimes, you know, you get a game, you pay a few bucks, and you get a board. It's full of little holes, and there's a mole coming out, you know, and they give you this
Okay.
hand, and you whack it on the head, and you try to, and the idea is to try to whack as many as possible within a certain amount of time. You win a prize, but you can never whack them all. It's like trying to solve all our irritants and problems. There will always be more, always be more. So you could call that second lane the whack-a-mole lane.
Mm-hmm.
The lane of trying to get less and less of what we're trying to get rid of all our problems. But it's again, it's it's an impossible task. And what happens is that double lane highway, which has, you know, the two lanes of trying to please the ego and trying to whack all the little problems that we have. We think we're going to be happy if we ever get to it. But it's a winding highway, and there's always, happiness is always around the next corner, around the next bend in Tomorrowland. Think about this. Anybody who's listening who happens to be a parent, your preschoolers are probably dying to go to school. Students, they can't wait to retire. Retirees dream of, workers, they dream of retirement. And retirees long for their younger, healthier days. They're all dying to live. And they're all feeling like they're missing out. And you could call it, I suppose, the double lane highway. You could call it the road of the highway of the if onlys. Happiness is always around the bend. That's why it's always elusive. We never reach it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it's very interesting, but also, you know, you made this comparison with this game, but I also think, thanks to you, about this elusiveness or about our life experience. Uh, uh, Thanks to you, a joke that you tells in your book, and I will ask you to tell us this joke. Maybe many people knows this certainly, but for the last weeks, it's one of the best joke that I can tell people. It's
Really?
about the two hunters, two
Oh,
mooses,
yes.
and a pilot. So that's our life of service to our ego. It's a very interesting comparison.
Yeah. You want me to tell that joke?
Don't tell this joke. Yes.
Sure. Okay. So these two guys, they go hunting out in the middle of nowhere. There's in the forest, and they're it's so remote. The pilot, they need a pilot to get them over there, and then pilot comes out, and after a couple of days, pilot comes back, and they see that the two hunters have shot two moose, and they say the pilot says, "Oh, maybe I should have told you, but this little plane can only carry the three of us and one moose, not two." So the hunters say, "But last year's pilot told us we could have two moose." So the pilot goes, "Well, I suppose it could be okay." So they load up the two moose, the two guys, and the pilot, and they take off. But being too heavy, they crash on a nearby hill. So everybody walks out. The hunters, they're scratching their heads. What do you think we are? And the other hunter goes, "Well, I think we're about 2 kilometers west of where we crashed last year."
Exactly.
The point of the story
Yeah.
is why do we keep making the same mistake over and over? Why do we keep thinking that if we keep doing what we've been doing, that we'll get different results?
Yeah.
And in our
And it,
search for happiness, we're never really reaching it, and that's the purpose of the analogy. We're
yeah.
always we always think that if we keep doing the same thing, eventually that we think we'll be happy, but no, it doesn't work.
Yeah, and you also said that we are very often enslaved by our ego. And
Yes.
what I found very interesting in your reflection on Beatitudes, that you present this way of this teaching, this road that Jesus suggested to each one of us in Beatitudes as a way of freedom.
Yes.
So tell us, how do we move forward? And you use also, maybe it's necessary to explain to the people or tell us a little bit more. You tell us of this comparison that who you call wax figures.
Wax, but yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do we recognize that we're enslaved, and how we take this path to freedom?
Ah, very good question. The wax figure notion is it's a term that was coined by Father Maurice Zundel, who I don't know if have you heard of Father
Yes,
Zundel? Yeah, he's
he was the preacher who was very close to Pope Paul VI.
yes, yes, he was very admired by Paul VI to the point he invited him to speak at the 1972 Vatican retreat. The point with the wax figure is that Father Zundel compared much of humanity to a wax museum. Um, Now, what's in a wax museum? Wax figures. Wax figures are not alive. They're objects. They are things that portray life. And he was saying that when all we do is obey biological impulses and primitive instincts, when we refuse to be what we were designed to be, then we become as if trapped in a wax figure. We become lifeless. We live and die as a thing, because our whole life has been a stimulus response kind of life, which any good behavioral psychologist could have probably predicted at every turn how we were going to react. We get insulted, we want revenge. This happens, this, that. You can probably program an android to do that. But what he said is that we become trapped in that figure and in that kind of wax figure. And the saddest part of that is that we can come to believe that life has no meaning. Because if all we've been is a stimulus response object, then we're probably right in saying that our life had no meaning. Because if we haven't loved, if we haven't if we haven't been through or have followed in God's advice, we can end up easily trapped in that wax figure. And that's a sad part, and could even lead people to believe that there's no God, because then they'll say, if life has no meaning, then there's no God to give it meaning. And that's the saddest part of that. That's what the wax figure is about.
Yeah, and so you said to at least a certain questioning, or at least provocation, the challenge to all of this. It's the way of Beatitudes.
Yes.
So how do you see the Beatitudes as a constructive challenge to this emptiness, at this void that is in us? How the
Yes.
Beatitudes can help us?
I love your questions, by the way. They're very well thought of. The Beatitudes are, to me, it's a prison break from our ego. It's to find true freedom. But what is freedom? Freedom is not just being able to do what we want, because what we want is to become a better and better slave to our ego. That's why I think there's more freedom in following the advice of Jesus, even if it got us wrapped up in barbed wire in the bottom of a dungeon, black dungeon, than in all the rights and freedoms charters of the world. If you want to answer your question more to the point, we could go maybe over one by one on the Beatitudes to explain to you how I think it's the way out. See, we spend our whole lives being a servant to our ego. So how do you can't by just force of willpower get out of that. There'll always be the call of the wild, and Jesus showed us how to do it. And if you want, I'll do it.
Yeah.
It starts with, what's the first beatitude? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed as in happy are the poor in spirit.
Yeah.
The poor in spirit, what does that do? If we can come to terms with how poor in spirit we are, and we all are, if we can actually come to understand and feel in our hearts our poverty of spirit, well, that knocks our ego down a couple of notches, doesn't it? And
Yeah.
by doing so, it allows space in our heart for God. If we're full of ourselves, there's no room in our heart for God. And that's why it's no coincidence, in my view. I don't think it's any coincidence that that was the very first beatitude, because it it creates humility. Humility, in my view, I've always thought of humility as being the first of all the other virtues. If you don't have humility, I don't think any of the other virtues are possible, or any of the other beatitudes. It has to start with humility. And what better way than to come to terms with how poor in spirit we are? The
Yeah,
second
Eugene,
beatitude,
yeah, Eugene, before we move to the
yeah,
second one, let's say, because I think for many people today, humility is really scary,
yeah,
because very often we confuse humility with humiliation.
yes,
It means I am nothing, I am worth of nothing, and because we think in this way, we always want to be valorized, always to be gratified, always to be put in the front stage. But the real humility is precisely not this. It is the recognition who I am today in
mhm,
front of God, in front of others, in front of myself.
yes,
But it doesn't mean that I cannot improve, that it doesn't mean that I can move forward. And I think this is a very important distinction that we should make. And you explain this in your reflection very well in the book. So it should be done. And then when we recognize who we are, and then we can see how we are and what we want to move to, when we are ready to take the second step. So what is the second step?
the second step. The second step is to mournfulness. And by the way, I really appreciated what you just said, which reminds me that for all of this, we need the grace of God. I don't think it's a matter of like being there and by force of will, I will now feel my poverty of spirit. I think we have
Yeah.
to pray for it. It's a divine thing, and all things divine come to us from divine ways. So thank you for saying it. Yeah, the second one is the mournfulness. I don't think it's possible to have really come to terms with our poverty of spirit without somehow mourning about it, being
It is
mournful about it.
surprising. It is very surprising. Explain this to us. I loved this part of your reflection because it's one of the very interesting, but usually we want to be happy,
Yeah,
smiley, and it's
yeah.
normal, I would say. But why it is important to mourn?
But it's here we're on the road to God's version of happiness. It'll be at the top of the 8 stairs, I promise. But first you have to go down to the basement to
Yeah,
take the elevator to go up. That's
yeah,
where we are now. We're going to the basement
yeah.
where we come to terms with our poverty of spirit and we mourn about it. And what it does, it helps to tame the ego that has been bullying us all our life. It helps to tame that ego by feeling that we're unworthy of God's visit. Funny thing, one of the strangest things about God's ways is that the least we feel worthy of Him, the closer He is to us. I've read many of the great saints, the biographies of the great saints. They all have one thing in common: they considered themselves the worst scoundrels in the world. Some of them went into long exiles to avoid being admired because they considered themselves the worst of the worst, because they had come to terms with their poverty of spirit. They had mourned about it. St. Paul, he cried about it. St. Ignatius, yeah, they've all done it. And I think it shrinks our ego a couple of notches more. It makes yet more space for God to come in our hearts. And I think if we're going to be to, acknowledging if we come to terms with how poor in spirit we are, and then we mourn about it, it can't help but make us feel small. Another word for small is meek. Happy are the meek.
Yeah.
It all fits together. It's one step after another. Happy are the meek. What happens when we feel meek about it? We drop our defenses. We surrender to God. Now, until now, we were just making more space for God, but now we're starting to look forward to His visit. We're starting to hunger starting to hunger for his visit, because now we feel meek, we're receptive to his visit. And that's precisely the fourth beatitude. Happy are those who hunger. Hunger for what? Not for revenge. Hunger for righteousness, hunger for the ways of God. And that's where it's at. It's once we've acknowledged our poverty of spirit, we've mourned about it, we feel small and meek about it, then we're on the road to recovery. What happens when you're on the road to recovery? You get a newfound appetite, a hunger.
Yes, you find the essential, what is really important.
Yes, now you hunger for what's out there. You've been through you're going through a transition. You've gone through the ending. Now you're in the transition, and you're proactive, and you invite God, knowing He even brings dinner.
Yeah.
So in my book, I make an ongoing analogy about how this ties into God visiting us. Now we're at the point. Before we were just making room in our house for Him, and then we're actively looking forward to Him. But now we're actually calling out to Him. We call, hey, come on in.
Yeah.
But now doing our part. Now we've hungered for that, for God's righteousness and so on. But we understand that we have to do our part for it. And what's the best thing we can do for righteousness in the world? Forgiveness. It was one of Jesus's most repeated words, like forgive your enemies. What's another word for forgiveness? Mercy. Happy are those who are, blessed are the merciful, which is the fifth one. It follows naturally.
Yeah.
If we're grumpy and we have grudges against other people, if we have not forgiven, we're not going to hear a knock on the door when God comes in. We won't be listening. And if God comes in, we're not going to listen to Him because we're busy with our grudges. But what happens when you forgive, it releases you from that, and then you listen, then you hear a knock on the door, and you open the door enthusiastically because you have forgiven, and you're ready for God's visit. Now, what happens when now the fifth one was happy are those who are merciful. When you have been merciful, you've forgiven, that purifies the heart. You've unloaded a whole bunch of grudges and dark thoughts and so on, and it liberates you from those grudges and jealousy, and we're cleaner inside, And what is a clean house? With my ongoing analogy of God's visit, it's easier if you're visiting a friend and he's full of dirty garbage and smelly socks all around, it's not inviting to stay. I think if we'll never be perfect, we'll never be pure, but Jesus said, happy are the pure of heart. I think that if we follow all the steps until there, and we're to the point that we're merciful and so on, it helps to purify our heart, and it makes it easier for God to stay within us because we're focused on Him now. We're no longer all these grudges. Having that pure heart, now having been liberated from all those grudges and so on, we now receive inner peace. When we forgive, the automatic reaction, what happens automatically is we get inner peace. It makes us natural peacemakers. Happy are the peacemaker, blessed are the peacemakers, which is the next one, peacemakers. Now, if you visited a friend and you find them and their family in full conflict, you're going to probably sense some tension, and you might be looking for an excuse to make an early exit because you're going to sense the tension. It's not welcoming, But if you're a peacemaker and you're at peace with everyone, it makes it very much more. It makes it easier for God to stay within us. And the final one is blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. And look, God's ways are not the ways of the world. And so for some strange reason, the world doesn't value very much, as a rule, clean-hearted peacemakers. Because the meekness that got us there, the meekness and all the things, the qualities that got us there, forgiveness, and so on, could be perceived as weakness. But meekness is anything but weakness. But I'm just saying that's a side
Yeah,
thing.
but
But
you know, this last one is also true that then someone is in the really good, peaceful, let's say, divinized posture, we become jealous.
yeah,
We become disturbed. So for whom this guy is taking himself. So
yeah,
the persecution is because it sends us like the reflection in the mirror of our own self, and maybe uncorrespondence to this true nature of ourselves. Because I would say, Eugene, when you were talking about all beatitudes, you know, the reflection that comes to me, it also, there is a sentence that is attributed to St. Augustine. We don't know if he said it or not. Thomas Halleck, a theologian who is quite reflective, published a book about this based on these sentences. I want you to be. It means I want you to come to the world as you was thought and created in the love of God. And when you were talking about the Beatitudes, I was thinking, but Eugene is always saying God is doing this, or we are doing for God this. Sometimes, you know, it could be a little bit like at first sight devalorizing, ourselves. But in fact, when we welcome God, we truly become ourselves.
yes, yes. It's who we are. We're built for the high sea, but we remain moored to the pier. And if we become who we're designed to be, that's being ourselves. And we're being ourselves when we get out of ourselves and focus on other people.
We
And
come
and I
out
think
yeah, we come out of these masks that we created for ourselves and for others, and we really
yeah,
can be ourselves.
yeah. And and I think that takes us, that very thought, I think it takes us to the punchline about, after the eight beatitudes that ended with persecution. By the way, I was going to say last thing about persecution is that we can expect the persecution also from being, anytime we try to follow God's ways, there's going to be the cynics. I mean, we're not going to get fed to the lions, but sometimes the mockery can sting like a bee. And if we visited a friend and found that and you knew that they had been through a particularly rough day just for being your friend, and they and faced up to people who had picked on you, wouldn't you be tempted to give your friend a big hug and then you're happy how they persecuted? At the top of the so that's an 8-step stairs. At the top of the stairs, what's at the top of the stairs? I think it's it's love. It's love. Look, the less ego we have, the more the more space for God. And what's God? God is love. I'm not saying that. Don't take my word. I think that's the Bible.
Yeah.
John's saying that. God is love. When you're rid of your ego, or you minimize it to so much that there's space for God, God's within you. And St. Augustine, who you quoted earlier, said one of the sentences, I think his sentence, in my mind, pretty much summarizes the whole Bible. It summarizes anything I could ever write about in any book I could ever write. One small little sentence is genius. He said, love and do what you want.
Yeah.
And
Uh,
if we love,
mhm.
and because if we love, think of a mother looking at her little baby, and they're looking at each other and smiling at each other. Does that woman need commandments and rules to tell her how to treat her baby? No, love and do what you want, because what you want will be what's best for that person. And if we can love, but it's not normal. It's not natural for us to be that way. We need the grace of God. We could talk about that if you want, but I talk about it in my book. I think we're not going to do it by ourselves. We're not going to get
Yeah.
there on our own. We need the grace of God.
You know, what is also I would like to say for participants of our webinar, because we cannot talk about everything. We just make feel what you are talking, and pick up a few subjects, but and themes. But what I found very interesting, and maybe this is the last thought in our discussion before we move to the conversation with the participants, but I would like to underline in your reflection, which is, you tell us what is the challenge of the problem, of the problem of the challenge. What are the way of solution, the kind of elements for the recipe of the real happiness, and the steps by one. And it's very interesting because, very often the preachers, they pick up one beatitudes and completely forget the others. You took a really traditional path of the fathers of the church and great mystics to say one step after another, and it's like a ladder that brings you closer to God. You also give some practical advice in the third part of your book, and I think it's very interesting. But the last point that I would like to make, and I like touch it slightly just during the last question, that when you reflect on this, and when we discover who we are fully human are, and how we become fully human, it's your reflection, in my view, could be appealing not only to believers, the believers could find their bread in this reflection and deepen their faith. But I also think it could be very unexpected help for even no believers, because what you're saying, God is not here to indoctrinate, enslave us. God really is helping to free us and become ourselves, and so to accomplish our humanity fully. I think I understood you rightly. You can correct me.
You're absolutely right. I think, I think we're on the same, he's on the
Yeah.
same wavelength, on the same page. A lot of people see religion, they see God as a brake. It's not a brake, it's a gas pedal. It frees us from ourselves. I think of it, if I can make a quick analogy, it's like every person is like a three-stage rocket. The biological is the first stage, psychological is the second stage. That's enough to get us into orbit.
Yeah.
But if you want to break from the orbit onto our full potential, you need the grace of God, the spiritual grace of God, and that breaks us free from that. And we only get it by praying for it. You can't muster it in your head. You have to pray for it humbly. And if we pray for it, God will give it to us.
Thank you very much, Eugene. Leslie Jane is back, and she will help us to go through the questions from participants. I hope we have a few one.
Yeah, we do have one. This is from Ruth. What the conversation that you guys have been having thus far, especially regarding the Beatitudes, and would it be easier to achieve if we stop thinking like the secular world that we're in today?
If we stop thinking about it from the point of view of the secular world,
Yeah,
I would say on the contrary.
really.
Yeah, I think we have to bring it into the secular world. We have to bring it into today's reality, and open the church windows wide open, and go out and make it work in daily life. It's not, I often think that there's not two, three, four different kinds of truth. It's not like a scientific truth, a theological truth, a philosophical truth. There's only one truth, and this works. The Beatitudes, they're a way for us to find what we're each of us looking for every waking moment of our lives. Not just in church, but in every day, every moment of our lives. If we can bring that, if we can apply it in our lives, it's I I believe, in my heart of hearts, I believe it's the only way to shrink our ego enough that we stop being a slave to it. Then we start living. Then we come alive. Then we're free. And we'll stop trying to become better and better slaves all our lives. And that's what, because otherwise that's all, what we're doing. And I think that might resonate with people who are even non-religious and my first book was all about becoming a believer. And I've quoted, 17 Nobel Prize in physics who now believe in God for various reasons. We don't have the time to go there, but you can even prove scientifically, no kidding, today with discoveries that God exists. And that's why I think when Jesus came to talk to us, I'm thinking, wow, the author of the universe has told us how to become happy. How can we not listen? It's not just for the churchgoers, it's for everybody. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's a great answer.
I think it's very interesting that you are saying precisely what we were talking at the end of our conversation. The Beatitudes is the teaching of Jesus do not disconnect us from the real world, but really free us from the old falsehood in which we imprisoned ourselves and
Yes.
reconnect us to the real world.
And absolutely, and it frees us from the daily torture of indecision between doing what's right and wrong, between lies and truth, between serving and not serving. And there's no greater prison than the one we impose on ourselves. And Jesus said, here's the key. It's a jailbreak. I could sum it all up saying, the Beatitudes is a jailbreak from our ego.
Yeah. We don't really have another question.
Yeah, another
No,
question.
go ahead. We don't really have another one, so
Okay.
I know, Edward, you always have one up your sleeve.
Yes,
if you have.
but I would ask you the question about let's imagine in our families we all know that some people are very believers and very practicing, and sometimes they make feel everyone around that I am here and I will let you know God's will. And
Yes.
some people are very far or a little bit frightened, or let's say a little bit undecisive. So, how, in the way of the Beatitudes, we can help each other to navigate the way of happiness? Is there a way?
I think the short answer, what comes to my mind is that by practicing the Beatitudes, we can become an example, and we might attract people that way rather than by condescendingly saying, do these things and you could be like me. It doesn't work that way, because it's for many people, it's going to be repulsive, I think it's just a matter of trying to become a good example and have listening to other people. I enjoy very much the volunteer work that I do, and sometimes I ask people, what was the best moments of your life, and they teach me. I say, what have you learned? And they have to think about it, and in thinking about it, they learn from their own experience. Actually, I wrote my thesis on experiential learning. But we learn best through our own experiences. And I got to get this little analogy in before we go. One man that I was asking, what were the best moments of your life? And he said, oh, the last 2 weeks. I said, but you've been in palliative care the last 2 weeks. He was suffering. The man's dying. Happiest moment of his life, last 2 weeks. I said, how so? Well, he said, my family and I said, we never talked about stuff like loving or hugs. We weren't that kind of people. And there were a lot of tensions between us and so on. And he said, since I've been here, he said, I'm hearing stuff that I never heard before. There are a lot of mournfulness about the past, about, and asking forgiveness for this and that. And I'm thinking, and then I was thinking of all the Beatitudes, they're mourning about it. They feel small about it. And, they were forgiving, a lot of peacemaking, you know, the Beatitudes. And the man had tears of joy in his eyes. He was in beatitude. There's a good example of how this works in real life. And I could go on. I could give you other examples that I've seen. But I've seen tears of joy. You know, one lady, she couldn't remember the words to the Lord's Prayer, and she was crying, crying. She said because she hadn't prayed for so long, and she was asking God's forgiveness. Tears were coming, and I said, you know, I think you've given me just the best example of what Jesus must have meant by happy are those who mourn. And her tears became tears of joy, and it's like she shed a burden, you know. And I could go on, but those are real life examples of applying of the Beatitudes in practice. So this is not just you know, theory or whatever.
Yeah,
I've seen it.
it's not just a theoretical
Yes,
reflections.
when you
So
see tears of joy,
yeah,
that's beatitude.
yeah. Leslie Jane, do we have another question or no?
We
So
really
I will.
don't. I think,
Yes,
yeah.
I think people may be a little bit so inspired that like wow. But I will ask you, Eugene, because in the third part of your book, then you reflect how it works, how beatitudes work. You proceed very often via three steps. It's reflect on it, apply it, and rechannel it.
Yes.
Can you explain to us participants of this conversation, how do you do this? Reflect on it, apply it, and rechannel it. Take one of the Beatitudes and just help us to go through. And I think it might be very helpful for each one of us
Yeah.
after the webinar or after the reading the book or with the webinar and with reading the book.
Yeah, that's a great question. Because in the word rechanneling, it brings up the notion that we're all different. We're all different people. You can reflect on these things, but it's not one size fits all. And in the third part of my book, I talk about how we're all different. Some people might apply this in a certain way. They'll reflect on it, but they'll rechannel it. I'll get to rechannel in a minute. But some people are extroverted. Some people are introverted. 49% of Canadians are introverted. I'm certified in Myers-Briggs, by the way. Yeah. And so we're either introverted or extroverted. Some people are focused on concrete objects, concrete things, tangible. Others, abstract concepts. Some people they make decisions with their heads, cold hard logic. If this, then that. Others, they make decisions about how they feel about it with their hearts. Finally, another distinction is whether a person is oriented to tradition and structured, organized tradition, or versus novelty and keeping it always open. You get the idea? We're all so different. And in the third part of my book, I ask a bunch of questions to help people come to realize, what kind of person am I, and how can I best apply my reflections and translate it into concrete actions in my life? Because it's not going to be the same way for you or me or other people. We're all so different. But by asking the right questions, we can come to see, how am I different? How do I, because we each have a unique relationship with God based on how we're wired, how we are. And for the rechanneling, there I'm saying, if we're passionate about something, then yes, great. Some people might say, but being meek and self-effacing, you know, like we have to be in the first few Beatitudes, isn't that contrary to evolution? Because, you know, we carry within us countless generations of passion passed down from in our genes. Isn't that contrary to evolution? No. Every civil engineer knows you can't stop a raging river. If you're passionate, St. Paul, he was passionate, you know. St. Ignatius couldn't wait to get out there and fight the enemies. But what they all did is they rechanneled that energy into worthwhile things. Many of the saints, I think we have to be a little passionate about all this, or it's not going to work at all. You know, if we're not passionate, if we're just, yeah, lukewarm kind of thing, it's not going to work. Great that you have passions. So the short answer to anybody asking, do I have to tame my passions? No, don't tame it. Reroute it, rechannel it. It was Martin Luther King who said something like, um, realign your quest for greatness with selfless aims. Strives to be first in service and love. You know, so if you've got quest for greatness, try to be first in service
Yeah,
to others. I think it kind of works that way because great ideas don't like mediocrity. Steve
yeah.
Jobs once said, "One home run is better than two doubles.
Yeah, yeah,
Go for gold."
but also once you experience the deep and the true reality, you don't want to set up for mediocrity. There is another thing, but
Yes,
you were making me maybe for the participants and for example for myself, but I already read the book, but I can reread it again. But maybe this kind of self-discovery could be very appropriate for the period of Advent or Lent, for people who are believers or no believers, personal, and maybe even to read it and share it in the group. And if they're not too far from Ontario, let's say they might even connect with you, invite you. So, I see
sure.
I see your reflection not only just one time thing, it is something that we invited to come back and also to share. And I like when when I read your book and when we talked, I had this impression that you really want people to get on the road and to say, let's walk this way.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I like your idea about the Advent because what's Advent? It's preparing our hearts for the coming of Christ. And what better way to prepare our hearts than to walk through what He told us to walk through, and to shrink our ego so that we can make room in our hearts for Him.
Leslie Jane,
Yeah.
do we have another question or I will ask the last one, but no, I can ask the last one.
Sure.
Yeah,
So
go for the last
I
one.
will ask for the last one. Let's say, I'll ask you, Eugene, what is the beatitude that is most comforting you personally? And what is the beatitudes that is most challenging you personally?
Okay. Okay. All right. Yeah. Hey, you asked some good questions. I'd have to say that the first one, to come to terms with our poverty of spirit, has to be. It's hard to say which is the most important one, how do you juggle? But I think without that first one, none of the others would be possible. And which is the most challenging one for me? I'd say purity of heart, because I'm no saint. I'm no saint, but I'm working on it.
If you would really
Work in progress.
yes, receive my comment on this. Once upon a time, I read the commentary of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux on the Beatitudes, and Bernard made a very clear statement. If you want to be pure in heart, you should practice mercy. So
Yeah.
that's the key. And as
Yeah.
you said, one follows another. So we should pay attention to the previous one if we want to achieve those who are challenging us.
I see them absolutely as steps, and the immediate step after
Yeah,
mercifulness, purity of heart. There you
yeah,
go. So Saint
yeah,
Bernard, yeah.
yeah. Leslie Jane, the time runs very quickly, so it's now to you to help us to wrap up our webinar and to end it in a very good way.
I feel like you guys had a really great conversation, so much that the Q&A is honestly just filled with people sharing gratitude and just their own insights on how they feel inner happiness and peacefulness inner peacefulness and happiness are actually accomplished like through the grace of God. So I feel like you really did spur like a conversation that wasn't, it definitely wasn't surface level. Like you really got to like the heart of
Yeah.
people. And I just really appreciate that. And I know like our Novalis team appreciates just your book overall, Eugene. So because it does like help people so much.